Many anime fans nowadays are familiar with the Fate franchise. Some through direct exposure to the series, and many more by exposure to the plethora of memes surrounding it. It has certainly become a massive franchise that is responsible for getting new fans into anime and keeping old fans returning. If we look at some numbers, just for the mobile game alone, we can see that it currently has 32 million downloads worldwide, and in Japan alone, it has a monthly active user base of roughly 1.26 million unique players. Now, these numbers don't even take into account how many other people engage with the series on other ways aside from the mobile game. And with so much content to do that with, it's no wonder that people can spend hundreds of hours just exploring Fate-related topics and content. But what if I told you that there exists a story that takes place within the same parameters as the Fate universe? All of those complex magic systems and strange otherworldly concepts are alive within a different story called Tsukihime. And that story actually predates Fate Stay Night by about 4 years. If you saw last week's video, then you may have heard me offhandedly mention it in reference to some of the other works written by Kinoko Nasu, author of the Fate franchise. While not his first work, Tsukihime represents a very important point in Nasu's career and his creative future, because this was the first visual novel that he would publish under the doujin publication group known as Type Moon. This visual novel was a dark fantasy that followed Shiki Tono through a thrilling adventure that dealt with mature themes similar to what we see in Karda no Kyokai, another popular series written by Nasu. See last week's video for more information on that show. Many of the themes and concepts envisioned here would go on to inspire the Fate franchise and become staples of the Nasuverse that we take for granted today. While not all concepts first appeared here, such as the Mystic Eyes of Death perception, which first appeared earlier in Karda no Kyokai, this work was responsible for making them integral parts of the world that Nasu was trying to create, and from this point, they grew into the massive multi-million-dollar franchise that Fate has become. I think for those reasons, it's worthy of discussing just what makes Tsukihime so good, and why has love for this one-off visual novel survived all these years? Now, I think it's best to start with some background for those uninitiated. Tsukihime is a visual novel that has 5 main routes, and each of them differs from the previous in pretty drastic ways. These routes all follow a different love interest and depict different story events that make for a wide and varied selection of different plotlines, all under the same title. One common thread amongst these stories is that they are not aimed at a young audience. This story covers dark and gruesome themes, and if you're playing the original games, it also involves a certain degree of sexually explicit material. Although, like with the Fate franchise, these bits are usually left out of adaptations, and they seem to be something that Type Moon has tried to distance itself from in recent years. Now, there are a few key distinctions that I think make up the core of Tsukihime's appeal. 1, variety, and 2, subject matter. First things first, Tsukihime is a varied and multifaceted experience. Due to its nature as a visual novel with multiple routes, you can play this game over and over with very little recycled content. This game splits the routes very early on in its story, and as such, multiple playthroughs feel extremely different from one another. While the setup at the beginning for the story will always be the same, it doesn't take very long to get into new material, and I think more and more we're seeing games trend towards replayable experiences that are designed to stick around for a long time through games as a service models. But Tsukihime and other branching path visual novels of the era were focusing on replayability since 2000 without any plans for DLC. Now, this kind of variety is great for a game's longevity and for players who seek the most amount of content per dollar. But another kind of variety speaks to me a bit more personally. One thing that Tsukihime does really well is variety within its cast. There are a ton of different characters in Tsukihime, and they all feel extremely unique from one another, yet oddly cohesive. In fact, I think that's one of Nasu's biggest strengths as a writer. Being able to take an extremely large and eclectic world and wrap it into one smooth experience is really something special and impressive, and we see that in Tsukihime. This story features vampires, magicians, deadly priests, and conglomerates of evil goo that all feel like they belong in the same world. No two characters really feel the same, even if they can be classified under the same net. For example, let's look at the maids, Kohaku and Hisui. While both are maids at the Tono mansion, and twins, they boast extremely different personalities and play very different roles in the story. Now, I won't go too much into detail about what those roles are to avoid potential spoilers, but let's just say that their roots in the game are some of the wildest available. And then you have characters like Nero Chaos, who is literally the combination of 666 souls formed together in a vain attempt at immortality. Now, this guy is such an interesting villain in just premise alone, and yet he's completely outshined by the rest of the cast. While some may see this as a negative that he doesn't receive more screen time, I think it plays into his mysterious nature and really speaks to the quality of characters that the game does choose to highlight. This story doesn't really need to exploit such a high concept antagonist, because it can rely on its more detailed cast members to carry interest. Characters like CL are interesting vessels that the story uses to explore and expand its world. Through her, we're introduced to the Holy Church. Fate fans will recognize this as the organization that oversees the Holy Grail Wars, and as such, you may be clued into its more sinister nature. In fact, the darker nature of the church leads me right into my next point, the darker and more mature appeal of this story. Coming hot off the heels of Kara no Kyokai, Tsukihime may not seem quite as grim, but when compared to the vastly more popular work of Fate Stay Night, Tsukihime is downright depressing. It is much more serious in tone, and is keen to point out the inner struggles of the main cast, as well as their more physical challenges. We can see a great example of the more serious tone in a few characters, but I think Shiki Tono is our best example. Our main character is gifted with the mystic eyes of death perception, and unlike in Kara no Kyokai, here they are much more of a substantial burden. Shiki Tono is heavily affected by his altered sight, unlike our other protagonist who possesses the same eyes, Shiki Ryogi. In Tono's case, without intervention, his sight can cause him extreme discomfort and dizziness, and if pushed to its limits, it could rewrite the metaphysical wiring of his brain and essentially kill him. This point of conflict is always being brought up, and as such, it adds a level of dramatic tension each time Shiki is put into a situation that necessitates their use. Over the course of the story, he uses them more and more, which builds the tension and causes concern for his safety. This is an excellent way to build a plot device that is essential to the story, but also adds a host of negatives. At first, the Mystic Eyes of Death Perception seem like an overpowered ability that can turn almost any character into a killing machine for no reason. But Tsukihime shows that while these eyes are powerful, they take a strong mental toll on their user, and not any old Joe off the street can have them. This goes a lot further than just the risk to his health as well. Early on in the story, when Shiki's ability is still new, we see him struggle to come to terms with it from a philosophical standpoint. Turns out, being surrounded by physical depictions of death at all times, no matter where you are, is not great for your mental health. Surprise, surprise. One thing that Shiki talks about specifically is the fragility of life, which I briefly mentioned in last week's video. In this sense, there seems to be a common theme between these two stories. When gifted with eyes that can see death itself on all humans, animals, and objects, life becomes much less permanent, as everything is only one small cut away from the void. This psychological cost really pains Shiki, and it takes a lot of time for him to accept it as part of his life. In fact, if it weren't for a pair of special magically imbued glasses that block the lines, it's entirely possible that Shiki would never have overcome this struggle. This right here, this is how you use magic systems and world-building concepts to interact with your characters in unique and interesting ways. This tale is not one that uses its power systems for flashy and novel effects, but rather it decides to implement them in meaningful and impactful ways that dictate not just story events, but character interaction and development. Shiki is the way that he is, partly because of his past as a character, and partly due to his trauma surrounding his eyes. Characters like Ciel and Arcuade are also characters whose personalities are highly dictated by extraordinary circumstances surrounding their lives, but I'll let you see those firsthand when you read it. I really love the way that Type Moon executes its power systems in all of its properties. From Kara no Kyokai to Fate Stay Night and the million Fate spin-offs, each character is constructed in a careful and thoughtful manner as to intertwine them naturally with the events of the narrative and the world in which they live. Put simply, Tsukihime may not be the most popular work that Type Moon has released, but as is evidenced by the strong community surrounding it that still exists to this day, it was clearly something special that deserves a closer look. If you're someone who's new to the Nasuverse and you haven't really heard of Tsukihime, I recommend playing the original game, but I understand that not everyone is a fan of visual novels, myself included. So if that seems like far too much of an undertaking, the Tsukihime manga does a wonderful job of adapting the first route of the game, and I would absolutely recommend starting there. If you like what you read in the manga, then the original game is always available, and you can pick up right where you left off and try a different route. To sweeten the deal, Type Moon just released a trailer for the upcoming Tsukihime remake, And if you like the animation in Fate Grand Order, then you are going to be blown away by some of the footage shown off for the remake. All things considered, now is a very, very good time to get into the story of Tsukihime. So, if all of this hasn't been enough to convince you, well, I don't know what will. Hey, thanks for making it to the end of the video. If you made it this far in, then you probably liked what I had to say. If that's the case, be sure to leave me a like so I know I'm doing something right. And be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an upload. Also, I have a Twitter and an Instagram if that is something that interests you. Links to those will be below. But with all that YouTube stuff out of the way, I just want to say thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.